Today, we're going to talk about this concept of aspirational debt. And aspirational debt has to do with the modern condition. And the modern condition is really not defined by a lack of ambition. Economically, you really can't afford to have a lack of ambition, but that's created another condition. The modern condition is defined by an overproduction of imagined futures. Um, our goals multiply very easily, and our systems, our internal systems, our identity systems, our motivational systems, they fracture under the weight of those multiplying goals. And beneath the popular diagnosis of feeling overwhelmed, there lies something more structurally significant. And that is the internal accrual of what we might call aspirational debt. Now, this is not the result of distraction alone or procrastination alone or poor time management alone, although all those things are both symptoms and contributors to aspirational debt. Aspirational debt is the consequence of an unresolved contract with multiple versions of the self. Versions that are idealized, versions that are historicized or inherited. And each self carries moral weight, and failing to live up to these internal ideals doesn't simply feel like inefficiency and not accomplishing enough. It actually feels like we're betraying ourselves for not accomplishing all that we imagine. So, as always, I like to frame this in the context of past conversation about concepts that can inform what we're talking about. So, the first conversation partner that I want to introduce is a paper, a 1986 paper by Hazel Markus and Paula Nurius called Possible Selves. And in this paper, Possible Selves, Markus and Nurius introduce a framework for understanding how individuals organize their future identity and how they structure that future identity. So, possible selves refer to the cognitive representations of what a person might become, what they hope to become, what they fear becoming. These are not idle fantasies. They're moralized projections. They actually guide behavior. They regulate emotion, and they set the terms for internal judgment. So Marcus and Nurius argued that these selves are structured along affective gradients or emotional gradients, desired outcomes and feared outcomes, and that they help to regulate the direction and energy of our present behavior. The problem arises when these selves proliferate without integration. And over time, they begin to conflict with one another. And the result is this psychological load that mimics a kind of commitment, but produces paralysis. So we might contrast this possible selves view, right, where we have a proliferating amount of selves that begin to crush us, with another work by Carol Dweck, a 1999 work called Self Theories. And Dweck emphasized the role of implicit beliefs about the self, particularly whether attributes are fixed or malleable. So when Marcus and Nurius foreground the imaginative architecture of the self, Dweck stresses the interpretive schema that filters whether future identity shifts feel viable at all. So together, these theories suggest that both the quantity and the interpretability of our imagined futures play critical roles in how goals will shape or distort or constrain agency. So, how do we move then from possibility to burden, right? Because possibility sounds liberating, but the experience itself feels constraining. So most people assume that having multiple goals is a sign of ambition. But when those goals are tethered to unexamined internal contracts, selves we feel obligated to become, they really stop serving as a strategic direction and start functioning as emotional debt collectors. But consider the cumulative moral pressure of these kinds of like internal avatars, right? You have this internal avatar of the self who finishes a novel, the self who builds a startup, the self who gets lean, the self who travels the world, the self who masters philosophy, right? Each represents a possible self, but they're not co equal. They emerge at different points in life. They're shaped by different constraints, different aesthetic ideals, and different social environments. And when they remain active, um, unarchived, and unexamined, they pull on the system simultaneously, generating not direction, but contradiction. So, aspirational debt is what accrues when none of these selves are consciously discharged. They remain open processes. They continue to emit signals of obligation, but they no longer generate energy, only guilt, which leads really to the ethical weight of giving up. Because to abandon a goal is not merely to reprioritize, it is to rewrite an ethical attachment that we have. And most internalized goals carry the logic of a moral identity. And letting go of the self who writes a novel is not framed internally as a strategic shift. It is often framed subconsciously as failure or weakness or cowardice. And this is what makes pruning so difficult. Strategic pruning requires not just decision making, but also grief and acceptance. And grief is metabolically expensive. Most people choose instead to hold on to goals symbolically, if not actively, and tolerate the resulting fragmentation. This is not indecision, it is grief avoidance. So, what's the next step for us? Well, we have to reclaim present tense agency. The resolution of aspirational debt does not require radical abandonment of ourselves. It requires rather architectural clarity. So, which goals are still alive? Which are remnants of a self that no longer exists? Which generate an animating tension and which only produce shame? The challenge is not to feel better. The challenge is really about letting go. The challenge is to regain the structural capacity to act in alignment with a coherent self model. And this means consciously retiring certain selves, not as a failure, but as a closure. It means understanding that integrity is not about maintaining every commitment you ever made to yourself. Integrity is about being able to locate the self from which action legitimately proceeds. And in that sense, the real work of goal setting is not prioritization, it is authorship.